what we have right now is a game of chicken in which the Iranian government understands it has more leverage and understands that it has effectively won the war at this stage, but the U.S. government refuses to step back. And that's in no small part because the U.S. government historically is very good at rejecting reality and wars of choice from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. It has not learned from its past. And the Iranians are trying to make sure that it does this time around. Now, whether the U.S. government actually does learn is a whole other question, of course.
Back to the war doom loop of Iran versus U.S. Now, the U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding officially expired this week with no final deal, no ceasefire in effect, and no agreement to even extend it. That expiration lands as Israel continues pounding southern Lebanon, killing dozens in relentless strikes. So why does Netanyahu keep using these moments to derail any lasting deal? And why won't Trump use the leverage Washington actually has? And why does the path out of this Iran war doom loop run through Lebanon? To break it all down, we are joined by Alexandra Langlois, senior editor of Dawn's Democracy in Exile and a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities. Joining us from Denver, Colorado, Alexander, welcome to BT Live.
Of course, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you on. Let's jump right into it here. You've been, writing a lot over the year about the U.S.-Iran war and about specifically the Lebanon-Israel-U.S. agreement that took place a couple months ago. So we're going to kind of dive into both of those topics, but I want to start with the U.S.-Iran MOU, which is now dead. And we're already seeing Trump ramp up the threats again. Back in April, you wrote about why U.S. military pressure on Iran isn't working. And I was looking back at that piece myself over the last couple of days. And I'm curious, does the same analysis, do you think, hold today? Because it seems to me that the U.S. is just kind of kicking the can of defeat down the road, maybe until midterms, but that's not really sustainable. And it doesn't change Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. So I guess looking back on your piece from April, what remains the same and what has changed, if anything?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me on. So, I think that not a lot has actually changed since April. I think it's been this status quo of strikes, not strikes. Oh, we're talking, talks are going well. Oh, they're actually not going well. Just cycle of this, right? And so the war's not truly ended like I think a lot of folks like to pretend that it has. And that's why I think that ultimate conclusion still sticks. In the end of the day, the Iranian state believes that this is a existential war, and it is. And so it's going to do what it takes to survive that war, whereas the United States chose a war of aggression, right? And so in the end of the day, the Iranian state is going to act in its interests to survive that war and has the leverage to do so. The Strait of Hormuz is kind of the biggest self-own, if you will, that I've seen from U.S. foreign policy decision in a long time. A lot of folks were warning that the Strait of Hormuz was a leverage point for the Iranian government. They've done so for decades. And sure enough, as soon as the war was started with Israel against Iran, the Iranians took control of the strait. That is a leverage point that may lose some influence or leverage over time, but that's going to take years for that to change. And so what we have right now is a game of chicken in which the Iranian government understands it has more leverage and understands that it has effectively won the war at this stage, but the U.S. government refuses to step back. And that's in no small part because the U.S. government historically is very good at rejecting reality and wars of choice from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. It has not learned from its past. And the Iranians are trying to make sure that it does this time around. Now, whether the U.S. government actually does learn is a whole other question, of course.
Yeah, I mean, last month, Alexandra, you wrote a piece for the Center for International Policy titled "The U.S.-Iran War Cannot End Without U.S. Pressure on Israel in Lebanon." It centers on the now dead MOU and specifically the first clause, which demanded a ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon. This was quite historic, but Israel refused, and you wrote that Israel's political leadership believes it can skirt the demands of its patron, even when its decisions go against U.S. interests. That seems to hold across every front that Israel is fighting on. No matter what U.S. leadership demands, Israel carries its wars on with U.S. money, weapons, and diplomatic cover. And while the Trump administration has gone after Israel rhetorically, although mildly so, it has refused to use any levers of material pressure to change Israel's behavior, whether in Gaza or in Lebanon. So, talk about this dynamic and why it makes ending any of these wars actually impossible.
Yeah, I mean, this is the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, right? While we love to pretend that the U.S. is the patron, it doesn't act that way, even though it can, and that's a problem, right? The Israeli state has learned long ago that it can do what it wants to do in the region and will have U.S. backing because the political costs at home for politicians, for our political class in the United States, are simply too high, or they believe it's too high. Now that's shifting, and we can maybe get into that later, but in the end of the day, Israel has learned long ago that it can do what it needs to do to achieve its interests, even at the expense of U.S. interests. And you see that today, I think, in an extreme form. Lebanon is essentially a lever that the Israeli state can pull to sustain other aggressions across the region, and that emanates from Gaza, right? So a lot of what you saw in Gaza, the genocide, Israel's genocide in Gaza, led to strikes in Lebanon, led to the invasion and the occupation of Lebanon. It produced more strikes in places like Syria and Yemen. It led to the war on Iran. And so what Israel now does is when it starts to see progress in any one of these theaters, is it pulls the lever in another one to essentially to escalate the situation and spoil talks. And until the United States government recognizes this, and actually materially acts on it as opposed to rhetorically acting on it. And if that, although that's even questionable, you're going to continue to see the same pattern again and again and again. And that's why you have these, I think, pretty poor deals, or if you can even call them deals. I don't like to call them that, but for the sake of conversation, deals in places like Lebanon, in conversations between the U.S. and Iran, that are meant to kind of show progress, when in reality what we're seeing is a choice to sustain war across the region. And that's why, in my opinion, at least, Lebanon sits at the core of this, because it is the easiest space outside of Palestine for the Israeli state to play that spoiler role, because it forces, especially between U.S. And Iran talks, it forces Iran to make a choice at really important times in those talks, either to defend its axis of resistance partner in Hezbollah and thus defend its credibility, or to continue through with talks and then crush its credibility with its axis of resistance partners. Now, those things, that matters a lot, that choice does, because either way for Israel, it's a win, right? Israel either thinks that it's harming the connections between Iran and its partners across the region, or it completely destroys talks meant to at least stop the fighting between Iran and its patron. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so on the subject of Lebanon, let's dig into that a little bit, because there have been 7 rounds now of these negotiations between the Israelis and the Lebanese, overseen by the U.S., hardly a neutral arbiter. And there's an 8th round of negotiations scheduled for next month. And in those talks, Lebanon signed on to this trilateral framework agreement with the U.S. and Israel that effectively cements Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon. You've called this a recipe for disaster. And of course, I'm speaking to you from Lebanon. So here on the ground, that is how it looks. It looks like a disaster, especially for Lebanon, which has continued to be bombed, though maybe at a less intense pace than before this agreement was signed. But certainly, there was a massacre just this weekend in the south. But I'm curious, from outside, why do you describe it in that way, as a recipe for disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the so-called deals, right? The idea of progress, when really this war has been ongoing since at least 2024 and before. And so it's really important to note that there hasn't been a ceasefire. This is still not a ceasefire in Lebanon. And that's why it's a disaster, right? You cannot achieve a true deal between Israel and Lebanon without including Hezbollah, one of the primary combatants in that fighting in the first place. You cannot achieve a deal that ends what is first an Israeli occupation, which they claim to be is indefinite. You cannot do that without including a group that's backed by hundreds of thousands of Lebanese. And that's the reality, whether folks like it or not. One's opinion on Hezbollah has nothing to do with the fact that an organic political movement has say in the direction of its country. And this deal essentially rejects that in its entirety. It really just reinforces a long and unfortunate history of international actors having imperial ambitions in Lebanon and taking away from Lebanese sovereignty. And that's actually the irony of it in and of itself. And I think Lebanese recognize that. is that in order to gain some idea of sovereignty, this current reform government is actually ceding it to the United States, to Israel, at the expense of an organic political movement within the country that they deem political rivals. And that's why it won't work. And frankly, the disaster component is that it could lead to a real civil conflict. Lebanon is not far away from its last civil war that was nearly 15 years long. There are still very real questions have been left unanswered from that war in and of itself. The Taif was not necessarily a perfect solution to that war, right? A lot of folks that are running political parties today in Lebanon are war criminals from that war in one way or another. And so when you're reinforcing this, you're not solving the problem. You're just continuing it, right? And again, it places all of the onus on Hezbollah and none of the onus on the actor that is very actively and illegally occupying its neighbor. And has been very illegally striking it and killing civilians by the hundreds, by the thousands for well over a year. And so these are things that we need to recognize. It goes back to the issue of the U.S. ceding to Israel these operational kind of choices. It's not in the U.S. interest to allow Israel to do this to Lebanon, and it's not good for Lebanese either. It's not good for Israelis either. And that's the reality and why this deal is a disaster. It's not workable, and it adds a lot of bad faith kind of into the negotiations to actually solve this problem.
And to build off of that, it's interesting because obviously the MOU has expired between the U.S. and the Iranians, but that MOU, as you've written about, the first stipulation in it was a demand to cease fire on all fronts, and also respect the territorial integrity of all fronts, including of Lebanon. Lebanon was specifically named, which is why, as you mentioned, uh, part of this deal basically gives the Israelis the opportunity to undermine, or the MOU is dead, but to undermine that MOU. And Marco Rubio played a major role in spearheading this deal. He's like a part of the sort of like very Netanyahu aligned faction of the Trump administration. That was, I guess you could say there's like the JD Vance side and the Marco Rubio side, and Marco Rubio went out on this one. But now that this MOU is dead, do you think the U.S. Iran settlement ultimately still does run through Lebanon?
Yeah, I think it's a major part of it because of Israel's spoiler role. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Strait of Hormuz is the most recognizable and immediate issue, right? That's not an issue that's going to be resolved even in the next 2, 3 years, even with efforts to build pipelines all across the region to kind of divert energy flows to places other than Hormuz. But in the end of the day, like I was saying earlier, the fact is that Iran also does have it places a lot of importance on its axis of resistance allies. And that is why, again, Lebanon can be such a spoiler environment for the broader talks. Iran fought tooth and nail to include Lebanon in that MOU. And while that MOU is dead, it is still, in my opinion, a general framework for any future talks. I think it's a realistic framework. I think the timeline and other components of it weren't necessarily very realistic. It wasn't the most detailed, and that's why you saw it collapse in the way that it did. But I think in the end of the day, Lebanon is still a central component of this, and I think it's actually the harder issue to resolve between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Whereas the Strait, I think, is something that is much more that can be worked out, I think, in a much more reasonable fashion than I think something like the axis of resistance can, where I think parties have harder lines, which is why Lebanon is still at the core of this.
Well, Alexandra Langlois, thank you so much for joining us to break all this down. Really appreciate your work on this and hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much.